Hey everybody, welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, Assistant Professor of Communication and Media at Lund University. Remember, you can follow the show on Twitter at SMNP Podcast, or visit us on the web at socialmediaandpolitics.org. All right, y'all. Thanks so much for tuning in. This episode is going to be all about the war in Ukraine and social media's role within it. And as we record this, we're about 1 month into that war, and events are still unfolding rapidly. There's a lot we don't know. But I think enough time has passed, and there's been enough material generated by virtue of digital platforms that we can kind of stop and take stock so far and think, what is social media's role in this war? And I think it's hard to argue that it hasn't played a fundamental role. Whether that's connecting Ukrainian refugees to host families in Europe, or whether that's Vladimir Zelensky's telecommunication with the West, but also his domestic communication to his audience in Ukraine, whether that's the Allied response and the shows of unity, both in terms of Europe and NATO, and even associated countries to those organizations like Sweden, Finland, Switzerland, and their support either through sanctions or through supporting Ukraine with arms. To what extent is this driven by social media? We'll discuss all of these topics in the episode with my guest, Professor Joshua Tucker. He is a professor of politics at New York University, and he's an expert both in the politics of Russia and post-communist regimes and at the forefront of leading research on social media and politics. So Professor Tucker is director for the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia at NYU, as well as co-director for the Center for Social Media and Politics, which does a lot of really hardcore, cutting-edge research looking at things like Russian disinformation through various machine learning and word embeddings and bot detecting algorithms and all kinds of cool stuff. So there's actually probably too much research to focus on in just one episode. So instead, we're going to have a general discussion about the role of social media so far in the war on Ukraine. And before I cut to that interview, I thought to plug a couple previous episodes in the podcast series we've done on Ukraine. One is with Katerina Kruk, who was an activist during the Maidan protests in 2014, and looking at her experiences with Russian disinformation unfolding in real time. And also, quite interestingly, with Vladimir Zelensky's social media manager when he was campaigning for president of Ukraine. And I think you can make some connections between his performances as a campaigning politician and some of the masterful work he's done in connecting with Western politicians, which is something we'll also talk about in the episode. So those are episodes 71 and 77, respectively. I'll put links down to them in the episode description. But without further ado, let me turn it over to Professor Joshua Tucker. Again, he's a professor of politics at New York University. Professor Tucker, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Thanks, Mike. It's a real pleasure to be here and great to talk to you again.
So I thought we could start out with a more general discussion about social media and the war in Ukraine. And to foreground that discussion, maybe it's best to start with the idea of information theaters as it pertains to modern warfare. Traditionally, in military terms, theaters of operation refer to battles over air, land, and sea. Yet, controlling the information environment has long been a tactic for shaping public opinion through wartime propaganda, for example. But maybe before unpacking this idea of information theaters, looking back on this war over the past couple weeks, what has struck you as being new or different?
It's a great question to start with. First of all, it's fantastic that you hit on the major point here, which is that, this is nothing new, right? Trying to understand information in the context of war and trying to control information theaters. What is new here, I think, is the same sort of things that are new when we talk about social media generally, which is that, you have the opportunity for horizontal networks to spread information, as opposed to previously where a lot of information gets filtered through editors and publications and things like that. You have the ability to spread information much more quickly. And we have this kind of virality issue where not only can things go out quickly, but they can spread to lots of people quickly. The other piece of this, which is sort of less new, but is still sort of new, layered on top of the sort of fundamental features of digital information, is images and video. Now, that's not completely new. Like, images became such a big deal during the Vietnam War when you suddenly had color photos coming out of wartime. And obviously we've had video with wars before, but I think as we sort of move over the last, 50 years into the sort of hardcore digital information environment, it's important to remember that not only can we have this information spreading quickly, it can spread with video and it can spread with images.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into this idea of images and visuals as we move through the episode. But first, let me ask you about these information theaters. What information theaters are at play in this particular war?
Right. This is also a crucial question. And I think it's very useful to think about 3 and possibly 4 different kind of information theaters. First of all, there's the information theater on the ground in Ukraine, where we're going to see all sorts of information about, real-time logistics of the war and short and sort of very medium-term developments. So the quintessential thing here is like, there's already been a deep fake out there that Zelensky was saying that soldiers should lay down their arms. If Zelensky disappears for a short period of time, I'm sure we're going to see all sorts of things around, is he dead? Is he alive? So there's all sorts of incentives to kind of manipulate the information environment within Ukraine. The second theater we want to think about is the kind of theater of global public opinion, where we have efforts that are made to shape the way that the world thinks about this. And in particular, pre-war, this was made to sort of shape the way that the potential alliance of democracies or Western European alliance or whatever exactly you want to call it, the NATO alliance, how unified they would be and how in agreement they would be on the validity of coming together for the war. So we saw that pre-war. We'll continue to see that as a very important audience. And then the third audience that's also equally important is the information context within Russia itself. Because like all autocrats, Putin needs to maintain the support of people in his state. Not as many people as you would need in a democracy, but he still needs support. And it's better for him if he's got both mass support and elite support. So the information environment in Russia has become kind of crucial. And then there's a kind of fourth ancillary kind of interesting piece, which is not directly related to this, but is interesting to talk about, which is the information environment in China.
Yes, I have a lot of questions I want to pick up on in terms of visuals and different information theaters. And you're right that I think a lot of this is not new. One thing that is new, though, and I know you've talked about this before, is the telegraphing of information coming from the Biden administration. And I want to get to that. But first, I want to lead with Russian disinformation, because you've been one of the leading experts digging into Russian disinformation in the context of the 2016 U.S. election, looking at the IRA and all different manifestations of Russian disinformation. And we'll come back to that later in the episode. But I do want to ask you more broadly about disinformation, because I've been quite skeptical that the amount of academic research on disinformation really matches up to the harm it poses to society. But I think that changes in wartime when the stakes are obviously much higher. So two-part question here. First, do you think the amount of research dedicated to disinformation is commensurate with the dangers it poses to society? And second, is disinformation associated with war operations somehow categorically different from a more general understanding of disinformation as toxifying the information environment?
Yeah, I mean, so as academics, we all sort of gravitate towards the shiny new thing a lot of the times because it's interesting and it's novel and we want to understand it. So I think the sort of academic focus on it, while probably a bit overblown, is understandable in the sense that in order to understand that maybe there's too much attention being paid to it, we have to pay a fair amount of attention to it so that we can actually get a good handle on this. What concerns me a little bit more, and where I kind of share your skepticism, is I've actually been worried about the sort of rush that we've seen, particularly in civil society, to coming up with all sorts of fixes for the disinformation problem without thinking of the unanticipated side effects that may emerge from some of these fixes. And also without, and again, thinking of big shiny objects, like I think there's been a tremendous sort of fascination of social media as a vector for spreading disinformation, which of course it is a vector for spreading disinformation. We don't want to get that wrong, but that is at the expense of looking at sort of larger questions about like disinformation emanating from politicians, or particularly in the United States, where we've seen the Republican Party turning to embrace sort of wholesale falsehoods, and especially the epitome of this was President Trump. So there's a bunch of things to sort of dig into there on different dimensions here, and it's a big question out there. But I do think as academics, it is really incumbent upon us to try to rigorously test claims about the harms of disinformation to society. And I think it's incumbent upon us to try to rigorously test interventions so that we understand what those interventions may or may not do. I mean, I wish there were more people testing interventions, not just academics, before they get rolled out in society, because I think there's as I said, there's a lot of opportunity here for unanticipated side effects, which we can talk more about when we get later on into the 2016 US election. But also we have new research in the lab where we've been trying to test a bunch of these interventions that we see are kind of popular in society. And we're finding things that are actually kind of quite surprising when we do that. But, to the first question, society's paying a lot of attention to disinformation. I think it's beneficial for society to have academics conducting rigorous research, given that society is paying so much attention to it, if that makes sense.
Definitely. And I mean, I think you mentioned this fourth Chinese information theater, where I know your research has done some of this, and also what we talked about on the show with the Stanford Internet Observatory, that they find that Russian disinformation aimed at Western audiences is to sow discord, whereas China is almost exclusively positive about pumping up China. And so I wonder, how do you think those two different theaters are interacting in this conflict when China's position as of now is quite unstable as to whether they are condemning or supporting Russia?
Yeah, no, I'm going to loop in on the back part of it. Yeah, so there's, as we both know, there's some phenomenal research out there by Molly Roberts and Jen Pan and Gary King looking at these different strategies of Chinese attempts to manipulate the information environment. And as you said, there's been this idea of cheerleading as a phenomenon as opposed to putting out misinformation. And you rightly note the question of discord, which we can come back to with 2016. What I think is interesting in the context of this kind of fourth information theater of China is not the information theater itself so much as what it says about the Chinese strategy. Because as you rightly note, China hasn't quite made up its mind, or maybe not quite make up its mind. China is trying to thread this kind of really difficult needle here. Because on the one hand, China has definitely positioned itself as a rising global power. At the sort of heart of Chinese strategic thinking is that they're a rising global power, and the US and the West are out to block China's rise as a global power. And therefore, things that chip away at the unity of the Western alliance, or at the strength of the Western alliance, and at NATO in particular, these would be well situated within Chinese strategic thinking and a kind of positive thing. On the other hand, as I mentioned before, as autocrats need support of their population to stay in power, the Chinese Communist Party, for at least the last few decades, has really staked its claim to power on improving the economic situation of the Chinese people, and has actually done quite a good job of this in many regards. But that means that China has really benefited from the globalized economy of the past few decades. And China benefits from this status quo. What we're seeing in the Western response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and not just from government actors, but also from private sector actors, is a real threat to the country that gets ostracized from that economic status quo. And I think China wants to thread this needle between, on the one hand, being supportive of their friend, the Russians, who are pushing back on the kind of NATO encroaching world order. And so that's why you saw this kind of drumbeat of support for the Russians before the war started. But in the same respect, they don't really want to put themselves in a situation where there's any real disruption to their economic access to the global economy. And I think you're seeing this kind of interesting attempt to thread this needle, whereby it's the rhetoric that they're using to support the Russians, but then on the ground, they're not really doing all that much that would involve skirting sanctions or providing economic support or even military support for the Russians. And so I think that's why this theater is so sort of interesting, because there's almost this disconnect where there's this rah-rah in the rhetoric that's not being really matched by action. And I think it's explained by this kind of needle they're starting to thread here. So this shows you another way that rhetoric and information theaters can essentially be used as part of a hybrid strategy, is it allows you to kind of feint in one direction and maybe cover up for the fact that you're not doing as much in that direction elsewhere.
Yeah, let's keep on this idea of geopolitics and information theaters and go over to the West, where the response and the intelligence coming out of the U.S. has been kind of a leader in the Western response leading up to the invasion, where the Biden administration was telegraphing all of this information like, hey, we think the invasion is going to happen Saturday or next week. And this was shrugged off by many observers, including most Ukrainians who thought the invasion would never happen. So what's your take on that level of transparency offered by the Biden administration? And more specifically, do you think that strategy of communicating intelligence is a type of learned response to Russian disinformation from 2016?
Yeah, it's so interesting that you bring that up. Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar, but there's actually been some work. There's a lab in the Netherlands by John Rosenbeek has been doing this kind of work on what they called pre-bunking. And this was kind of at the micro level. So in the lab kind of studies, if you expose people to disinformation beforehand, are they less likely to believe it afterwards? And I think like pre-bunking is having a moment right now, because on the macro level, that's kind of exactly what the Biden administration tried to do. Is yes, they telegraphed exactly what was going to happen, which kind of gave them credibility. But in a sense, it was all about saying, okay, the Russians are going to say X, but Y is going to be correct. The Russians are going to say they're not going to invade, but they are going to invade. The Russians are going to say this is because of a genocide in southeastern Ukraine against Russian language speakers. And then sure enough, the Russians say that's the case. And the Russians are going to say that, Ukraine is going to welcome the invasion, which of course Ukrainians have not welcomed the invasion. And so I think this is kind of, is it a learned response to previous attempts at disinformation? Maybe. Is it that someone got a hold of this kind of pre-bunking information and to try this as a strategy? I don't actually know kind of where it came from, but I do think it was highly effective in the sense that, and this is a sort of real plus for the Biden administration, because again, as we said, we were talking about a little bit earlier, I think that theater of operations was aimed at sowing discord among the allies that would comprise the Western response. It's hard to remember this right now, but 3 weeks later, but the reaction from the Western allies in the first 3 days of this war, of this invasion, on the economic side was really unexpectedly strong, right? And I think part of that was about really quickly dispelling these myths ahead of time. And on the one hand, you see this kind of pre-bunking strategy from the Biden administration. And on the other hand, you have what we started the podcast with, which is just, it's hard to contain information coming out of the battlefield when you fight a war in the digital information era. So the Russians' idea that the Ukrainian soldiers were going to lay down their arms and welcome the Russians, and we can talk about why Putin may have really thought this was actually going to happen. But in retrospect, it was complete disinformation. And it was impossible to sustain that because we had so much information coming out of the battlefield. Now, the Russians can to a certain extent, can control the information environment in Russia, but they have not in any way, shape, or form been able to control the information environment in Ukraine. They can pump disinformation into that environment, but they can't prevent information flowing out. So I think what you had was a kind of virtuous cycle of information. And it's funny you mentioned disinformation being overblown, because given my background, I got called by reporters, at the beginning of the conflict, and you would say, well, can you tell us about disinformation in this conflict? And I said, no, let's talk about information first. Don't jump first to disinformation, because I think we've sort of seen a kind of hearkening back to the glory days of social media, or the liberation technology days, that, in liberation technology was about people in authoritarian regimes being finally able to have access to media, right, that wasn't controlled by the state, and how that was going to lead to liberation technology, the Larry Diamond argument. And what we saw here, it's not exactly the same, but it's like a stronger power who put out a narrative about what was going to happen in a weaker power. And that weaker power was able to use social media, digital media, news, all these kind of digital information era tactics to get around the attempt to control the environment. And I think so it was a combination of this kind of cycle of the Biden administration sort of pre-bunking this, and the Ukrainians on the ground, supplying information, combined with kind of public outrage from the images. And that led to a kind of resolve that I assure you the Russians did not expect. And just one other note, I have been wondering this whole time what it did to Putin to see so much of his actual planning being publicized by U.S. intelligence. That's also got to sort of, you talk about, sowing discord. If I'm Putin, I'm wondering how on earth do the Americans know all of this so well?
Yeah, and I want to get to that, but I do also want to plug. We've done an episode previously on the bad news game, which gets this idea of debunking. So interested listeners can dial back to that. So I want to pick up on the idea that you started with about images and visuals being new here, and what you're talking about with Ukrainians kind of providing this terrible footage of on the ground these missile strikes, people fleeing, these crazy images we're seeing, which is quite unprecedented. We've seen it before with television, but not so much at a visceral level with social media. I mean, even in the Arab Spring, the quality of smartphones was much worse, right? So you had this grainy footage. Now we're getting it much more in high def. And I wonder, clearly this has had an important role here, I think a crucial role, but I wonder if you think that when it comes to the Western response, things like Switzerland joining sanctions, Sweden sending arms to Ukraine, Germany increasing its defense budget. I mean, these are really, really aggressive moves. Do you think this is the result of politicians being kind of affected by this personally, or do you think they're kind of protecting their capital for future elections by showing that they're doing something? I mean, I think that somehow there's a connection between these social media images and government response, but do you think it's more of an electoral strategy, or do you think that the politicians themselves are just affected by this footage?
And let's not forget Zelensky is zooming in to talk to parliaments around the world. Like, talk about you want to get like direct effect by things. Have we ever seen this before? A wartime president who, stuns the world by sticking in his country, that line in the beginning, you want to talk about memes, the line about, I need weapons, not a ride, or ammunition, not a ride. But then he still manages to address everybody's parliament daily. I mean, you talk about getting your message across. I think that's sort of earth-shattering, and that's really, really new. I don't think we've ever seen anything quite like that before. So my sense is it affecting politicians viscerally, or is it affecting them through political calculus? The answer's got to be both of those things, right? And I don't mean that cynically in terms of political calculus. Another place where I think we see this at work is the sanctions, right? Sanctions have previously been something that you think of as you put them in place, and then they're going to cost businesses money, and businesses try to find out ways to skirt around them. And then you try to block businesses from doing this, and you try to ratchet up the penalties for businesses, and it's that kind of a game. But it's like the assumption is that the businesses are going to want to get around the sanctions, so you have to really correctly incentivize them with legal consequences for getting around the sanctions. What have we seen this time? We've actually seen businesses and companies getting out ahead of sanctions that are not directly affected by sanctions, but fleeing from Russia, already. McDonald's pulling out, Starbucks pulling out. And maybe that's, fear of running afoul of sanctions. But I actually think there's something larger going on here, which is a consequence of social media and the digital information era and social media and politics, which is that this is happening in the aftermath of 2020, the summer of 2020, and the social justice movement in the United States, right? It's happening in the aftermath of the Me Too movement. It's happening in the aftermath of all sorts of, throughout Europe, all sorts of kind of wide-ranging, the Indignacios we can think of in Spain, right? Like that wide-ranging pressure being brought to bear quickly by civil society on corporate actors and on states as well. And so I think that, yes, absolutely, it would be really hard to sit here and say it's not a visceral reaction that some of these politicians are having from seeing these images. But I also think we are living in this era now where, and maybe I hadn't thought about like the quality of the images. I think that's a really good point. But we're living in this era where everybody knows that enormous amounts of social pressure can be brought really quickly. And I think you're seeing companies trying to get out ahead of that. And I think you're also seeing states and political actors trying to get out ahead of that. And, and maybe not even from a cynical thing. You can almost think of this as like, that these images are going to have an effect on your population, and that your population is going to be demanding action. And so you're thinking about how to demand action too. So I think the two are probably working together in that way. But I think we've hit a sea change in thinking about sanctions, because sanctions used to be, there was the stated sanction, but you knew the effect would actually be weaker than that because people would get around it. Now it's like there's a stated sanction, and if it has this kind of big moral connection to it and it has enough of a sort of central place in the public's vision, the sanctions can have more of an effect than policymakers think they're going to. Which actually, and if you talk to people who calibrate sanctions, sanctions are calibrated by thinking of the costs and benefits of the sanctions, and will the benefits outweigh the costs? Because there are costs to sanctioning business partners and trading partners, and people who institute sanctions are going to have to ratchet up that like their sanctions in the future may have more of an effect, which may ratchet up the benefit, but it also may ratchet up the cost.
Definitely. I want to pick up on two things you mentioned and kind of contextualizing a bit that I think the events we're seeing now are sort of conditioned also by short history. And the first is the idea of social justice protests and how we saw this kind of unprecedented action from companies coming out with these black squares, right? And saying that they promote the protesters. And so it seems that they're getting ahead of these sanctions in a sense is kind of conditioned by that experience to some extent. And then the second is Zelensky's teleconferencing is probably somewhat normalized by the fact that we've all been Zooming during coronavirus, right? If we didn't have Zoom for the past 2 years, that teleconference would probably be a little bit strange, but now it's so normal, right? So I think that these kind of previous events have made what the companies are doing and what Zelensky is doing much more normal in a way that maybe not have been in a counterfactual scenario.
Yeah, no, that's true. But I still think when the history books are written on this one, right, like the fact that he was able to both be a wartime president who stayed home and rallied the troops and simultaneously went around and spoke to the parliaments of so many countries is going to be taken as like a very, very new thing. But I think your point, well taken, that like, right, would that have seemed kind of strange had it not been for the last 2 years is an excellent one.
Well, let's talk about Putin himself. And I was looking around and specifically around the social media presence of Putin. I mean, we've seen world leaders like Trump, like Narendra Modi in India or Widodo in Indonesia, who really capitalize on providing updates from the leader directly. And as far as I could tell, Putin really doesn't have a sort of personalized social media presence, even on VK, which is popular in Russia. So do you think that Putin is maybe... First of all, do you know kind of what his social media presence is personally? And if he doesn't really have one, do you think it's a missed opportunity to connect directly with his supporters?
It's an interesting question. I mean, Putin has over the course of his time in power systematically extended his control over the media. It started with television. For a while, the state then controlled TV, which is where an awful lot of Russians get their news from, but still had a kind of thriving open internet. That's been chipped away at over time. Radio and print has been chipped away at over time. And then we've seen in the last month this sort of dramatic change in the state's attempt to control the information environment. That's not really the answer to the question that you asked, but I mean, so maybe it's part of the answer that he doesn't need to have Twitter to set the media agenda the way Trump did, because he can set the media agenda just by setting the media agenda if he wants to. But I think the other thing you might look to, and look, I am no, this is not my field nor my style of research, but if you want to go a little Kremlinology on this, I mean, Putin comes out of the KGB. That is his background. The KGB is very much secretive, controlling information. What is the stuff that's publicized about Putin? It's him in a fighter jet on the back of a tiger. I mean, not a tiger, but like on the back of a horse and, all these kinds of things. And these are very, very carefully manicured images, which, as we know, was sort of common in the West until probably about 10 years ago when people started experimenting with this. But, I've been sending students for years to interview the staff member and the member of Congress who controls their social media. And, with older members of Congress, and especially when we first started doing this like 7 or 8 years ago, you would always hear, everything that went out on Twitter had to be approved by 3 different people in the office, including the chief of staff. And, it was still seen as this kind of carefully manicured thing. So maybe it was just one step too far for Putin. Maybe it was seen as one step that was unnecessary. Maybe it just sort of didn't gel with him. The other thing is just like, since we're on the subject of Putin and images, I think that we want to mention right now, we're not focusing this podcast on why Putin made this decision to invade Ukraine. But going back to your recent events and COVID, talking about COVID, by all accounts, Putin has been incredibly isolated during COVID. And the visual imagery of him meeting with his top, his Secretary of Defense and a top general, and they're sitting literally 30 feet away at the other end of a table, or the images of when, right when the war started, right before the war started, when he brought in his Security Council, and he was literally it was in the Capitol Rotunda, and they were sitting on different ends of the rotunda. It's just, he is not having a lot of contact with many human beings at all. Obviously, we could be sitting here being like, and that's why he uses social media so much, because he doesn't like to talk to people. But maybe it's also, as a sort of larger issue of like, he's just really isolated inside a very, very tight circle of people. And maybe he doesn't have the same, need for instantaneous public validation feedback the way that Trump seems to.
And one more kind of general question about this conflict has to do with the social media bans of Facebook and Instagram in Russia. And I hadn't really thought so much about that, but I heard on a podcast yesterday about the main opposition leader, Alexei Navalny, who's also quite in isolation and who was sentenced yesterday. And I didn't realize that he was speaking with his lawyers, who would then provide his statements to the public through Instagram. And now that's going to be removed both by him being sent to a maximal security prison and the blockage of Instagram. So to me, that seemed like it would have some effect on the opposition. But what's your general thoughts about the overall kind of shutting down of Western social media companies inside Russia?
Yeah, I mean, look, we could spend the whole podcast talking about this issue. It's a big deal. It's a big deal because it makes Russia much more like China. And we had a piece a number of years ago in Comparative Politics called Turning the Virtual Tables, where we talked about different ways that regimes could respond to online opposition. And we talked about responding offline, like arresting Navalny and putting him in jail, or killing Boris Nemtsov and things like that, physically addressing, but also you can change like legal infrastructure, liability, and things like that. And then we talked about two ways that regimes could respond online. And one was to restrict access to content. And that's traditional censorship. And that's what we have long associated with the Chinese. And people have thought, this is something that's very expensive. The Chinese had armies of tens of thousands of people, dedicated to taking content off. They essentially had their own social media networks that they would monitor, get them to self-monitor. But that's sort of like the traditional way we thought about censorship. And then there was engaging with online content and trying to sort of change the narrative that's online. And that's where you get your bots, your trolls, your Russian interference in the 2016 election, all the stuff that we were studying with Russian bots domestically. And I think what we're seeing here now is, and I actually had written about this a little bit previously, that Russia was already moving towards a more Chinese style of, they were installing these there was an article in the New York Times a few months ago, they were getting these kind of black boxes that they could install at all these internet service providers, forcing them to install them to block access to certain domains, blacklisting certain domains and websites. And I think that what we've just seen is an incredibly accelerated pattern of this. And it raises larger questions. There was a piece in Foreign Affairs earlier this week by the head of the Peterson Institute about, are we witnessing a new phase of globalization where we're going to have sort of decoupling of different parts of the economy. And when you combine this with the sanctions, it's like the digital equivalent of cutting off the country a little bit. And so you see the West cutting off Russia's economy, Russia access to technology. You see the Russia, some export restrictions. But then by saying, no, we're not going to allow these sort of social media platforms in there, it's part and parcel of an approach to digital information becoming much more about the restricting access to content. And we know that that's costly. There's a reason that lots of regimes don't do that. And we know from Molly Roberts' work that, when China banned Instagram, that led to a massive upsurge in VPN downloads, which, by the way, I don't know if you've seen the numbers on VPN downloads in Russia, but the first week of the invasion, they went up by, thousands and thousands of percent. It was like, tens of thousands in the previous week, and it went up to, millions or monthly. It might have been monthly data, tens of thousands a month. But so all these things have unintended consequences. And just speaking as political scientists here for a second, right? We know that repression is costly for regimes. Autocratic regimes can stay in power by, they need to monitor information about their population. And the more open society is, the easier it is for regimes to monitor information and decide how to satisfy the population, make sure the population is happy with the regime. The more you engage in repression, the harder it becomes for the regime to actually understand what's going on in the population. And also, taking away Instagram here, that's something that the regime is doing, right? The Russian regime. This is not a Western sanction. This is the Russian regime doing it, and is now really taking away something that a lot of Russians really like. Now, will they swallow it because of patriotism and rally around the flag? And this is a wartime measure. Look, people do a lot of things in wartime, but it's yet another sacrifice that Russia is demanding from its own population. And it creates all these sort of downstream effects about making the Kremlin even more isolated from understanding society and society's preferences.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that last point because there's kind of two things. I mean, one is the popularity of Instagram in Russia. And I'm going out on a limb here and kind of putting some anecdotal evidence together. But I believe that part of the reason that Instagram copied stories from Snapchat in the first place was to stunt their growth in the Russian market. So they kind of had this early growth into Instagram. They were worried about Snapchat growing there. And then you have all these people who, they make a livelihood as influencers out of crafting their accounts on Instagram, growing their followerships, or just your average person who puts a lot of time curating that account. And we have a lot of research from the terrorist literature that shows that blocking people's accounts can frustrate them to the point that they act out on terrorism. So I do wonder, as you're saying about sacrificing Instagram, I wonder if this might actually backfire where people get so angry. Okay, they can download VPNs for a while, but a lot of people's livelihoods have been lost. And I wonder if that will make them turn against the government rather than just being kind of censored.
Yeah, this is the $64,000 question. And I would say that Instagram, back to our how different is everything about social media, it's just part and parcel of a larger thing. We could have the exact same conversation about iPhones, right? Apple's now not going to be selling iPhones. We could be having the conversation, tons of people in Russia have lost their jobs because of these, or are going to lose their jobs because of these Western companies coming out. This was a path to a comfortable, prosperous middle-class life involved working for all these foreign companies that were in Russia. That path has now been closed off. I mean, again, it's anecdotal, but I heard numbers yesterday at an event we ran of, I forget exactly what it was, but there are essentially tens of thousands of IT professionals who have left Russia. And a lot of them are actually in Istanbul. I think there's a thriving, you want to set up a startup right now, you should go to Istanbul, right? There is just going to be a huge kind of brain drain that comes out of the Russian system because of blocking this kind of path to what had been a kind of comfortable middle-class life for people who were sort of, especially if you were content to sort of ignore politics a little bit. And so I think the Instagram piece is part and parcel of this. And the huge question out there is, obviously people are going to be disappointed. People are already disappointed. People are incredibly frustrated. And as part of Putin's grand strategy, which I would argue is flawed on many accounts on this, but he did nothing to prepare the Russian population for the sacrifices that might be coming because of this war. So you have all of a sudden people's lives in Russia have been completely upended by this. Not having access to Instagram. For influencers, obviously, that's like losing their livelihood. For other people, it's another annoyance. But their lives have been upended in so many different ways. And the question is, A, what will that look like going forward? Will that just be a short-term shock, but then it kind of equilibrates at not too bad? Or does this something that continues to get worse over time? Like if Boeing won't sell parts to Russia to service planes, that's going to affect the Russian airline industry going forward, even domestically. And so, the question is, who will be blamed for that? This is a big part when we talk about the information environment, because I think a big part of controlling the information environment is constantly saying this is part of the West strategy to destroy Russia. It has nothing to do with the invasion of Ukraine. That's just an excuse, right? The West has been out to destroy Russia ever since the end of the Cold War. And this is part and parcel, and blame the West. If my colleague, Arturas Rosanas, along with one of our students here, his research on how Russia reports economic news, right? They looked at all these kind of newscasts, and what they found was that when there was good news, it was they didn't censor bad economic news, but when there was good news, they attributed it to Putin and to the Russia, and when there was bad news, they attributed it to the West. This is exactly the world we're in right now. What are the Russian people going to think? Are they going to blame Putin for this, or are they going to blame the West for this? And this is a humongous question, because if both the Russian public and the Russian elites come to blame this current regime, and we haven't even gotten into the idea of what is actually happening to the military on the ground and all the sort of soldiers who aren't going to be coming home from this, then I think we're in a different place.
Definitely. And I could keep asking more speculative questions, but as this crisis is unfolding, I think it's good for our listeners to get an update from an expert like you who has expertise both in social media and Russia independently and together. So Professor Tucker, thanks so much for taking the time out and sharing your insights with us.
Thanks, Michael. It's been great. It's been great chatting. And thanks for having me on the podcast.
I've just been speaking with Joshua Tucker, professor of politics, director at the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia, and co-director at the Center for Social Media and Politics at New York University. You'll find a link to the center down in the episode description. You can check out some of the research happening at NYU on social media and politics. And that's a wrap for this episode of the Social Media and Politics podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. Next time, we'll have Monica Hoopscher on the show to talk about anti-Semitism and social media and a new book coming out on the topic. But until then, I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Malmö. See you next time.